Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
4 minutes ago, Prince William opened a sealed envelope that had remained untouched since Prince Philip's death. And within seconds, the atmosphere inside Windsor Castle changed completely. The decree offered no gentle advice, no symbolic farewell, and no room for hesitation. It carried a direct command. Camilla was to be denied permanent access to the royal family's private residences, protected archives, family vaults, and inner ceremonial chambers. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William stood inside a restricted archive at Windsor, with Princess Anne and a legal advisor. A restricted archive is a secured royal records room, open only to authorized family members and officials. Philip's personal seal rested beneath the final paragraph, proving that he had formally approved the order before his death. The document also named his grandson as its executor, placing responsibility for enforcement in the prince's hands. William read the final paragraph twice. He lowered the pages, then asked whether the order still held force over the private estates. The advisor answered through a documented palace briefing that its provisions remained valid because they governed family-controlled residences rather than Camilla's public constitutional duties. Those duties were her official responsibilities beside the sovereign, but they did not automatically grant access to every private room or protected collection. The answer hardened William's expression. Refusing to act would mean rejecting his grandfather's final safeguard. Anne recognized her father's handwriting before anyone explained it. Grief tightened around her anger, as she understood that Philip had anticipated a crisis the family had refused to face. He had ordered the envelope opened only after confidential boundaries were crossed following Queen Elizabeth's death, and the wording suggested someone had produced proof. William carried the decree into Charles's private sitting room and placed it on the desk. The king read in silence, removed his glasses, and set them beside the pages. He saw protection. His father saw judgment. Worse still, the order struck directly at the woman he had spent years defending, making the conflict both constitutional and painfully personal. Camilla reached the corridor connecting the royal apartments without warning that morning. The household comptroller stopped her and explained that her authorization had been suspended under a sealed family directive, a private command governing access to non-public palace areas. She did not plead. She did not demand that the door be opened. She simply asked who had told William that the trigger conditions were finally met. That question changed everything. Philip's decree had not awakened by accident. Someone inside the palace had deliberately placed the final evidence in William's hands. The decree was written in legal language, but its true force was painfully personal. It placed William against his father, Camilla against the memory of a man who had never fully trusted her, and Anne between loyalty to the living monarch and obedience to the man who had raised her. Behind the palace doors, this was no longer a dispute about access. It had become a reckoning over belonging, legitimacy, and betrayal. William stood outside his father's study and repeated the same sentence under his breath. Camilla's public role was not the same as her private palace privileges. The distinction mattered because a royal role covered official duties beside the sovereign, while private privileges controlled access to family rooms, archives, estates, and personal property. He knew one careless phrase could make the decree sound like revenge rather than protection. Charles heard his son enter but did not immediately look up. The king finally broke the silence through a documented private conversation, later recorded by his secretary, telling him that Philip had never accepted the price of his relationship with Camilla. William answered carefully. This was not about an old marriage, public anger, or wounds left by Diana. It concerned actions taken after Queen Elizabeth's death, when protected boundaries were supposed to remain untouched. Camilla sat alone in a guest drawing room, reserved for visiting dignitaries. The queen consort had spent years carrying out engagements, standing beside the monarch, and absorbing hostility in public. Yet the locked family door now reduced her to a visitor. When an aide offered to collect her clothes and personal papers, she refused. She would not allow another person to carry her belongings out of a home where she believed she had earned her place. Anne felt the conflict cut in both directions. The Princess Royal remembered her father saying that palace access was a responsibility, never a reward gained through marriage. Yet she also saw the pain spreading across her brother's face. Enforcing Philip's order could protect the institution, but it could also break Charles at the most vulnerable point of his reign. Catherine found William alone later and warned him against allowing old grief to guide a present decision. The Princess of Wales reminded him that every restriction had to be explained as protection of royal records and private property, not punishment of Camilla. He listened because she understood what was at stake. One wrong move could divide the family, weaken the king, and make the future monarch appear driven by personal resentment. Charles discovered the deeper danger when he read the decree's estate clause. It gave William temporary authority over several privately controlled royal residences whenever the sovereign became emotionally compromised by a dispute involving his spouse. The provision did not remove the crown, but it could prevent the monarch from reversing the order alone. Camilla sent Anne a handwritten request to inspect the full document. She refused because the second sealed attachment remained unopened. Then, the date written across its cover changed the room completely. It matched one of the final private gatherings attended by Elizabeth, Philip, Charles, and Camilla together. To understand why Philip had prepared such an unforgiving command, William would have to return to the night when one private conversation turned suspicion into a permanent warning. The crisis did not begin with the unsealing of the decree. It began years earlier, during a private family gathering at Windsor, when one request made behind closed doors caused Prince Philip to end the conversation, leave the room, and summon his personal secretary before midnight. Those present dismissed his reaction as anger. In truth, he had decided that the palace needed protection from someone already inside it. Philip had grown deeply uneasy about the way private royal spaces, personal letters, and family heirlooms were being treated as signs of rank rather than protected parts of the crown. The crown, in this context, meant the monarchy's inherited institution, property, and duties, not simply the person wearing the crown. He believed a spouse could serve faithfully without gaining unrestricted control over archives, sovereign property, or rooms holding private material from earlier reigns. Camilla made the request during a private Windsor dinner. She asked Queen Elizabeth for permanent access to the monarch's personal correspondence rooms and the secure archive containing letters linked to Diana, Charles, and the early years of William and Harry. The Queen listened without interruption, but Philip placed his glass on the table and asked why she needed those records. Camilla answered that she wanted to protect the future king from selective history. She argued that unresolved letters could one day be used against Charles, especially if released without context. Elizabeth refused gently, saying those papers belonged to family memory and future judgment, not present control. The refusal should have ended the matter. It did not. Philip accused Camilla of confusing protection with power. Charles immediately defended her, insisting she was trying to prevent another scandal from damaging the monarchy. His father answered with words later preserved in a documented account by his personal secretary, "The institution becomes most vulnerable when one person decides which parts of its history deserve to survive." Anne followed Philip into the corridor after he left the table. The Princess Royal heard him say that access granted through affection could become authority exercised without accountability. She understood then that his anger was not only about Camilla. He feared Charles's devotion might weaken every safeguard around the family's most sensitive history. Philip summoned his solicitor that same night. A solicitor is a lawyer who prepares legal documents and advises clients privately. He ordered the creation of a family instrument restricting Camilla's access if she ever tried to enter, transfer, remove, catalog, or control material belonging to Elizabeth without unanimous family approval. He named William as executor because he believed his grandson would one day hold enough authority to act, yet still understand the human cost. Years later, after the Queen's death, a security register recorded Camilla's authorization code near the Forbidden Archive. The code appeared on 3 separate nights. The original refusal had never been reversed. When William carried those records into the same room as Camilla, one question remained. Had she crossed Philip's line herself, or had someone used her authority to make certain it looked that way? The palace had survived public scandals, broken marriages, and bitter departures. But this confrontation was different, because no one could hide behind ceremony. William stood opposite Camilla, with Philip's decree between them. Charles remained only a few feet away, and Anne guarded the sealed attachment like a final witness. For the first time, the Queen was being forced to explain why her authorization appeared beside a forbidden royal archive. William closed the library door and ordered every press officer, communications advisor, and junior aide to remain outside. The private library was a family room used for confidential meetings beyond the reach of the public household. He looked directly at Camilla and asked whether she had authorized anyone to enter Queen Elizabeth's correspondence archive after the late monarch's death. Camilla gripped the back of a chair but refused to sit. She said she had approved a security review because letters concerning Charles had been left vulnerable to leaks and selective release. The Queen Consort insisted through a recorded private account, later preserved by the household secretary, that her purpose had been protection, not control. Sake William placed the entry register on the table. The future king said a security review did not require 3 late-night visits, private keys, or the removal of 2 sealed inventory boxes. Those boxes mattered because they contained private family history linked to Diana and the early lives of her sons. Their disappearance threatened both personal trust and the integrity of the royal record. Charles stepped between them and accused his son of questioning the Queen like a criminal. The king warned that humiliation could destroy the family faster than any leaked letter. William answered that Camilla's title could not erase the conditions written by Philip, and rank did not place anyone beyond scrutiny. Camilla's anger finally broke through. She told William she had spent years absorbing public hatred to protect his father, only to discover that the family still saw her as an intruder. He answered that the archive contained private material connected to his mother. No one had the right to enter, examine, or move it without his knowledge. Charles lifted the decree as though he intended to tear it. Anne placed her hand over the page before he could move. The Princess Royal warned that destroying the original would not destroy the legal record or the copies held by Philip's solicitor. Camilla admitted ordering the review, but denied removing either box. She said the request had only been designed to identify correspondence that could threaten Charles's reign. Then the household security chief entered with a documented access report that changed the confrontation completely. One recorded visit had occurred while Camilla was attending an official engagement miles away. Suspicion shifted instantly. Someone had used her authority, understood the archive system, and deliberately left her name behind. William kept the restrictions in place until the boxes could be recovered. Camilla met his stare and vowed to prove that Philip's decree had been activated against the wrong person. The search would reveal that the real battle was not simply over palace doors, but over who controlled the monarchy's most guarded private world. Crowns create the appearance of absolute authority, but inside the royal household, power is divided among private estates, family agreements, legal custodians, and promises made long before the present reign. Philip understood that division better than anyone. His decree did not remove Camilla's title. It struck at something more immediate: the doors she could open, the records she could reach, and the private spaces where royal memory quietly became power. William held authority because he was not acting only as the future sovereign. The Prince of Wales was also Philip's named executor, meaning the person chosen to carry out the instructions inside the decree. That role allowed him to suspend archive credentials and enforce restrictions across several privately controlled residences while the investigation continued. Camilla could still perform ceremonial duties beside Charles, but official service did not automatically grant access to family vaults, personal archives, or estates held outside normal state control. William sat with Catherine after midnight, exhaustion finally cutting through his controlled expression. He admitted that enforcing the order made him feel less like his grandfather's heir and more like the instrument of an old punishment. The Princess of Wales listened, then asked the question he had been avoiding. Would he make the same decision if the missing archive contained nothing connected to Diana? Her words forced him to confront the danger that duty and personal pain had become impossible to separate. Anne refused to let emotion widen the decree beyond Philip's exact intention. The Princess Royal became its moral custodian, insisting that every restriction remain precise and temporary, where the evidence allowed. She warned William that protection could become retaliation the moment humiliation replaced necessity. He accepted the warning because Anne understood both her father's purpose and her brother's growing desperation. Charles summoned the keeper of the private estates and ordered Camilla's credentials restored. The keeper, an official responsible for access and management across family-controlled properties, refused without William's written approval. Philip's directive had transferred temporary authority whenever the sovereign became emotionally compromised by a conflict involving his spouse. Charles waited until the official left, then closed the study door himself. The king told his son that no monarch should be overruled inside his own family home. William answered that his grandfather had designed the decree precisely for that moment, when devotion to a spouse could silence every normal safeguard. Security experts then uncovered the first hard lead. The missing boxes had been transferred using an inventory code assigned to a retired royal librarian who had continued advising Camilla privately. A documented security report revealed that the man disappeared from palace service 2 days after the transfer and left no forwarding details. Camilla was moved from the private apartments into a separate residence until the boxes could be found. Staff no longer had to guess whether the family was divided. The separation had become impossible to hide. Then Anne received a telephone call that changed the investigation. One missing box had been located, not in Camilla's possession, but inside a locked room controlled by Charles. The discovery forced William toward a devastating conclusion. The person protecting Camilla from suspicion might be the very man whose throne Philip had tried to shield. The first missing box was not found in a hidden warehouse or a secret advisor's home. It was discovered inside a private room assigned to Charles, protected by his personal security clearance and excluded from the original search. When William learned where it had been hidden, his anger gave way to something colder. The investigation had reached his father, and the king's silence now carried more weight than any confession. William reacted before the palace could contain the damage. He suspended every movement of private archival material and ordered a complete inventory across Windsor, Sandringham, Balmoral, and Clarence House. An inventory was a formal record of every protected box, letter, and object held inside those residences. The order mattered because one missing collection could expose private family history, while another hidden transfer could destroy trust in the entire royal archive system. Charles entered the locked room alone and saw the recovered box resting on the central table. He remained motionless before asking who had authorized the search. The king then admitted through a recorded private conversation preserved by the household secretary that he had known the box was removed. He claimed he ordered it secured to prevent sensitive correspondence from being leaked, sold, or used against the monarchy. William felt the betrayal cut deeper than concealment. His father had allowed Camilla to carry the suspicion, while Philip's decree stripped away her access and forced her from the private apartments. The prince asked why Charles had remained silent during the confrontation. The monarch answered that telling the truth would have activated the decree against them both. Philip had anticipated that possibility. The document stated that any sovereign who knowingly assisted an unauthorized transfer would temporarily surrender control of the affected private estates to the named executor. That clause mattered because it placed William above his father in one narrow but explosive area. It also proved that the late Duke had feared emotional loyalty could overwhelm royal accountability. Anne carried the truth to Camilla's separate residence herself. The Princess Royal waited until the room was cleared, then explained that Charles had known where the box was. Camilla set down her teacup and asked every aide to leave. She did not shout. She simply said the king had allowed her to be publicly diminished so he could preserve his own authority. Camilla had mistaken his silence for shock. Now she understood it as calculation, and the sadness struck harder than anger. She had defended Charles through years of hostility, yet he had hidden behind her name when his legacy was threatened. Anne opened the recovered box under documented legal supervision. Inside were letters recording Elizabeth's concern that family history surrounding Diana must never be edited, suppressed, or privately managed for reputation. One message warned Charles directly that protecting the monarchy could never mean controlling how future generations understood its mistakes. Anne finally saw Philip's full purpose. The decree had not been designed only to restrain Camilla. It had been created to stop Charles from using marital loyalty as cover for controlling the royal record. Camilla sent the king one final message. She would not return to any royal residence until he told William the complete truth about the second missing box. For Charles, the crisis had become more than a struggle for authority. He now had to choose between preserving his marriage and exposing the secret he had protected from his own son. No advisors attended the meeting, no private secretary prepared the language, and no legal expert waited nearby to soften the consequences. Charles and William met as father and son in a small room away from the formal apartments, where the decree, the missing letters, and the weight of Diana's memory could no longer be hidden behind royal procedure. What the king said there changed the meaning of Philip's final command. Charles asked that Anne, Catherine, Camilla, and every palace official remain outside. He wanted no institutional buffer between them, only the truth. The king admitted through a recorded private conversation, later preserved by his personal secretary, that he had authorized the transfer of both archive boxes. He feared selected letters would be released after his death and permanently define his relationship with Diana. William stepped away from the table as the confession deepened. His father explained that Camilla had suggested a legal review, but she had never ordered the boxes removed. Charles used her authorization pathway because his own direct involvement would have raised immediate questions. The future king struggled to control his anger. He said the monarch had placed her name in the records while knowing Philip's decree could fall upon her. Charles did not defend himself. He admitted that fear had driven him to protect his legacy at the expense of his wife's dignity and his son's trust. The confession mattered because the crisis was no longer about whether Camilla had crossed a forbidden boundary. It was about a sovereign using another person as cover, then remaining silent while she suffered the consequences. Charles opened the second box under William's supervision. Inside were private reflections written by Philip and Elizabeth for their grandson. The letters stated that the monarchy survives only when its heirs are allowed to confront family history without alteration. An heir is the person next in line to inherit the crown and its responsibilities. Those words struck William because they transformed the box from hidden evidence into a final lesson. Charles signed a formal acknowledgement, surrendering control of the disputed archives and affected private estates, until a transparent family review could be completed. The acknowledgement was a written admission that transferred temporary authority without removing him as king. He then placed his signet ring beside the document, separating his personal authority from the decision he had surrendered. William chose restraint. Rather than expanding Camilla's exclusion, he narrowed the decree to its exact purpose and agreed that her private access could eventually return under permanent archive safeguards. Charles asked his son not to forgive him immediately, but to speak to her before enforcing the word forever beyond the truth Philip had known. Charles admitted he had spent decades fearing history's judgment. William answered that controlling the past only guaranteed a harsher judgment in the future. The prince left carrying the second box, not as a weapon against Camilla, but as evidence that could turn punishment into accountability. The final decision would now be tested before the household, the public, and the unforgiving memory of those who built the modern crown. By sunrise, the palace could no longer contain the story. Staff movements had been noticed, security credentials had changed, and Camilla's absence from the private apartments had become impossible to disguise. The public did not yet know every detail, but one message spread with extraordinary force. Philip had left behind a decree powerful enough to overrule a king and close the palace doors to a queen. Buckingham Palace issued a carefully worded statement confirming that access to certain private royal spaces had been temporarily reorganized during an internal review. An internal review was a formal examination conducted inside the household to determine whether rules had been broken. The statement did not mention the missing archive boxes, yet its silence only made the story grow. Those spaces mattered because they held personal records, inherited property, and family history beyond normal public duties. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, beneath the balcony, as newspaper vendors raised a front page dominated by the words, "Philip's Final Order." Separate photographs of William and Camilla appeared beneath the headline, turning a private family crisis into a public contest between duty and exclusion. A national presenter described the conflict as a collision between the authority of the living king and the judgment of the family's most formidable departed patriarch. Public opinion divided almost immediately. Some praised William for defending royal archives from interference. Others saw the decree as another cruel sign that Camilla would never be fully accepted, no matter how many years she served beside Charles. The debate mattered because it threatened the stability of the present reign while shaping how the future monarch would be judged. William watched the coverage beside Catherine and switched off the television. He said a private failure had become a national loyalty test. The Princess of Wales warned that silence would allow the harshest version of the story to become permanent. She urged him to separate Camilla's limited involvement from the actions Charles had concealed. Camilla prepared for a scheduled engagement before police postponed it over concerns about the crowd's reaction. The Queen Consort removed her gloves and quietly asked whether she was still expected to behave as queen while being treated as an exile. Her pain was no longer hidden behind ceremony, and the contradiction became impossible for Charles to ignore. Charles finally authorized the palace to confirm, through a recorded statement, that he, not Camilla, had ordered the transfer of the disputed archive material. The king's admission changed everything. Public anger shifted from her access to his fear, Philip's foresight, and William's willingness to hold his own father accountable. Anne addressed senior household staff and ordered them to show Camilla full ceremonial respect, while obeying every private restriction. The Princess Royal refused to let accountability become humiliation. William then announced that both boxes had been recovered, and the investigation was complete. Camilla returned to Windsor through the official reception door, knowing he waited inside with Philip's decree open before him. The same document that expelled her would now decide whether she remained outside forever, or whether truth had changed the judgment, written under different circumstances. The final ruling did not erase the betrayal, restore trust instantly, or pretend that Philip's warning had been misplaced. It did something more difficult. It separated guilt from suspicion, authority from marriage, and accountability from revenge. Inside the private library, where William had first confronted Camilla, The future king delivered a verdict that honored his grandfather's command without allowing the dead to dictate cruelty beyond the truth. William stood with Charles, Camilla, Anne, and Catherine, while the recovered boxes remained sealed on the table. A royal custodian was an independent official trusted to protect restricted records and prevent any one family member from controlling them alone. That safeguard now mattered, because the missing letters had exposed how easily fear, marriage, and personal authority could overwhelm normal boundaries. William stated the decision clearly. Philip's permanent restriction would remain in force over Camilla's independent access to royal archives, historic correspondence rooms, family vaults, and protected property belonging to earlier monarchs. She would never again enter those spaces alone or authorize another person to enter under her name. The broader punishment ended there. The lifetime ban from every private palace area was lifted because the investigation proved Camilla had not ordered the boxes removed. Charles had used her authorization as cover for his own decision, leaving her to carry the blame while he protected his legacy. William then announced lasting safeguards. Entry to restricted archives would require joint approval from the sovereign, the heir, and the independent custodian. No monarch, spouse, or future royal partner would ever again control the family's historical record alone. Camilla did not celebrate. She turned to Charles and asked why he had allowed Philip's judgment to fall upon her before admitting the truth. The king apologized before the family through a recorded statement preserved in the household account. He accepted the temporary transfer of estate oversight to William and acknowledged that fear had led him to betray both his wife and his son. Camilla accepted the apology without offering easy forgiveness. She told him trust would return through actions, not titles, ceremonies, or private promises. Charles lowered his head because he understood that keeping the crown did not erase the cost of silence. William closed the decree and explained Philip's true purpose. His grandfather had never intended to humiliate one woman. He had intended to prevent love, fear, or rank from placing anyone beyond accountability. Anne returned Philip's seal to the family archive, satisfied that his warning had been enforced without becoming revenge. Catherine remained beside William as he restored Camilla's residential access, proving that firmness and mercy could exist together. Charles remained king. Camilla continued her public duties. William retained temporary control of the affected estates until every safeguard was established. Philip's decree did not destroy the monarchy. It forced the family to admit that secrecy had become more dangerous than scandal. Camilla regained her place, but not unrestricted power. Charles kept his crown, but lost the protection of silence. William emerged not as an avenger, but as a future sovereign capable of confronting his family without abandoning compassion. When the library door reopened, Camilla returned to the private apartments under new rules. Charles followed without speaking, and William remained beside Philip's closed decree, knowing the palace had been protected not by exclusion alone, but by truth finally spoken and consequences finally accepted. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.